Our stories have never been the same since Ponce de Leon first arrived on our shores in 1513, in 1513. Now many have come here to Florida, oftentimes buscando tesoros, looking for treasures, or riquezas or riches, sometimes looking for new beginnings or new freedoms. Pero cada uno, each one has added to the sabores, to the rich flavors that make up this unique state. So many amazing people, algunos que nacieron aquí, some who were born here, others just passing through. But all of us have added our stories to the history of Florida. Today, I'd like to share some personal, historical, and traditional Florida tales to connect the people and cultures of La Florida, of Florida, con un poquito de sabor latino, with a little of Latino and Hispanic flavor. Un sabor, a flavor that permeates our more than 500 years of shared history. Let me introduce myself. Me llamo Carrie Sue Ayvar. My name is Carrie Sue Ayvar. Y soy cuentista, cuentacuentos, a storyteller. That's right, a storyteller. I make my living doing the very thing that used to get me in trouble in school. Yes, contando cuentos, telling stories. I truly believe that stories are the best means that we have of connecting people and varying different experiences. It's how we can bridge our different experiences. Cuentos explica de dónde venimos. Stories tell about where we come from. ¿Dónde estamos ahorita? Where we are right now. Y dónde esperamos ir, and where we hope to go. Hablan de nuestros valores. They speak about our values, de nuestras tradiciones, about our traditions, y nuestras historias, and our histories. Me? Well, I'm a third-generation storyteller, at least. I was lucky. I grew up with stories and storytelling. Mis papás, my parents, and especially mis abuelos, especially my grandparents, they told us stories. I was very lucky. I got to spend a lot of time con mis abuelos, with my grandparents. In fact, we lived with them for about 3 months every year. Now, I was born and raised in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, but my parents would bring me down here to Florida, where my grandparents moved when I was only a year old. Now, I know typically people from up north would come to spend a few months down here during the winter when it's cold. You know, snowbirds, we know that. But I don't think my family has ever been typical in any way. After all, I do make my living telling stories, right? So we used to come down. Actually, my parents would stay in Pittsburgh for the summers, but my siblings and I, we would come down every summer from the day school let out in June, and we wouldn't fly back home until Labor Day. My parents had their own flower shop, and they worked long hours during the summer, often 18-hour days, and so we stayed with my grandparents. Oh, and they were wonderful storytellers. My grandma Selma, she would tell us folk tales, stories from all over the world. At night she would ask us, where would you like to go tonight? And we would answer, me and my siblings, Russia, let's go to Russia tonight. No, Mexico, Africa, Australia. You know, I thought for years that she had been all around the world. It turns out she was just well read. And then there was my grandpa Nat. He was a Talmudic scholar like his father and his father before him. And he would tell us stories, and every kid in the neighborhood, every afternoon and oftentimes throughout the day. He told us stories to entertain us and to teach us. In fact, the first story I ever learned to tell, right here in Florida, at my grandparents' house, was a folktale about an ocean adventure. And like so many folktales, this one traveled. In fact, years later, I heard a version from my niece in Mexico, almost the identical story, with a slight variation. Now, the best part is that I now live in the very same house that my grandparents built in the 1950s in North Miami Beach. The very first place I learned to tell stories. I learned my craft, and I'm telling some of those very same stories today, like the one I just told. Often, of course, now I do it in Spanish as well as English. It seems especially appropriate to me considering our long shared history on this peninsula of Florida. Truly, our story never has been the same since the Spanish first arrived here over 500 years ago. Zora Neale Hurston, raised in Eatonville, Florida, in Central Florida, was an anthropologist, a folklorist, and part of the Harlem Renaissance, an amazing writer, and one of our true Florida treasures. She once said, folklore is the bottled down juice or pot liquor of human living, of human existence. And so, I would like to share one of my favorite folktales, one that is especially popular among Spanish-speaking Floridians. Zora Neale Hurston was right. Folklore is the boiled down juices of human living, of human experience. When people come here, they come with their stories, with their folk tales and their folklore, of course with their own views and their values. The other people, the very first people that ever came from other lands to settle in Florida were, of course, the Spanish. But they were not the first people here, no. There were, of course, others already here, indigenous tribes, which included the Apalachee and the Timucuans, the Calusa, the Yega, the Ais, and the Hobe Indians. In fact, when the Spanish first arrived here, they estimate that there were approximately 350 to 400,000 indigenous people already living here in what we call Florida. But we know, as I said earlier, our stories have never been quite the same since that Spaniard, Ponce De Leon, first arrived here in 1513. Now let me tell you a little bit about Juan Ponce de Leon. Era marinero. He was a sailor, con Cristobal Colón, with Christopher Columbus on Columbus's second voyage to the New World. But eventually, Ponce de Leon se hizo gobernador. He became governor of Puerto Rico. And it was there in Puerto Rico, que escuchó cuentos, that he started to hear stories. He heard una leyenda, a legend about una tierra del norte, of a land somewhere to the north, que estaba lleno de tesoros, that was filled with treasures, lleno de oro y plata, filled with gold and silver and all kinds of other treasures like they found in Mexico and in Peru. But there was also otra leyenda, there was also another legend. Una leyenda que decía, a legend that said that in esa tierra, there in that land of riches, había una fuente de agua mágica, that there was a magical spring of water. Y lo llamaron, they called it, el fuente de la juventud, the fountain of youth. Dijeron, they said, que si uno tomara de esa agua, if someone would drink from that water, quedaría joven, that they would stay young y fuerte and strong, young and strong para siempre, forever. Well, Juan Ponce de Leon decidió ir a buscar esa tierra. He decided to go search for that land, for he was no longer governor of Puerto Rico, and he wanted to find treasures. And he went to search, and on April 2nd, 1513, Ponce de Leon and his men landed on a beautiful shell-covered beach, somewhere near what they now call St. Augustine, probably closer to Ponte Vedra. And they claimed all of this land for Spain. He thought it was a large island, but he claimed all of it para España. Y lo llamó, and he called it Pascua de Florida, Feast of Flowers, or La Florida, Florida for short, for it was just at Easter time, and it was a lush, beautiful land. Seemed so appropriate. Now, Juan Ponce De Leon sí encontró aventuras. He did indeed find adventures. Y una tierra hermosa and a beautiful land. Pero nunca jamás encontró. But he never ever did find that land llena de tierra, una tierra llena de oro y plata. He never found a land that was filled with gold and silver. No. Y tampoco, neither did he ever actually find esa fuente de la juventud, that fountain of youth, no matter what you see in St. Augustine. But you see, he didn't find it. Y tampoco, neither did anyone else, at least not yet. Though I have to say, I do sometimes wonder, when I see some of those advertisements for certain skin care or certain pills, and it seems to me that certainly there are some that claim to have found at least some kind of fountain of youth. And while in St. Augustine, it is actually the oldest continuously inhabited settlement in North America, I want to let you know it is not home to the oldest European or even Spanish building in the United States. It is the oldest continuously lived in settlement, or at least European settlement. But the oldest building does go to a Spanish building, and it is here in Florida. But it was actually built 300 years before Columbus ever made it to North America. And it happens to be in walking distance of my own home in North Miami Beach. Well, how? How could it be built 300 years before Columbus made it to America? Well, it was built in the early part of the 12th century, but not in Florida, in España in Spain. The old Spanish monastery and cloisters were used as a monastery and cloisters. They were used as such for over 700 years, but eventually times changed, and it was converted to a granary and then a stable. And in 1925, William Randolph Hearst, the American businessman and newspaper publisher, he bought the monastery and cloisters. And then he had them all taken apart, piedra por piedra, stone by stone. Each block was packed in hay, carefully labeled and numbered so that it could be brought over here to the United States and rebuilt. Yeah, that's right, here in the U.S. But of course, first it had to go through customs. And at that time, there had been an outbreak of hoof and mouth disease. Well, of course, they did not want to bring that into this country. And every single one of those crates was opened. And some of them weighed over a ton. Every one of them was opened, though. All the hay removed and burnt. And then each one repacked. Unfortunately, the workmen doing it were not quite so careful or attentive to detail to make sure that each stone came from each crate it was put back into. And then, after all of that, they ended up sitting in a warehouse in New York for 26 years. Well, eventually Hearst, he sold them. He was hurting for a little bit of money at that time, and they were all sold, moved right down here to Florida to create a brand new tourist attraction. It was the 1950s. It took them 3 months just to unpack all those crates. In fact, Time magazine called it the biggest jigsaw puzzle in history. It cost $1.5 million. That would be closer to $20 million in today's money. And it took them 19 months until it was done. In fact, it nearly bankrupted the investors. Well, once again it was sold. And this time, the one who bought it donated it to the Episcopal Church of St. Bernard de Clairvaux. In fact, they still hold regular services in Spanish as well as English, though for now, the pandemic kind of has changed things a little bit and all the services are virtual, but they're still going on. It is a beautiful and popular place, especially for weddings. There's something almost magical about it. Yes, the forces of immigration are nothing new here in Florida. And sadly, those forces and the violence that are also part of the history has been harsh. Oftentimes, there was brutal colonization, slavery, slaughter. Why, Matanzas Beach, right up the east coast, not too far from St. Augustine, was actually named for mass slaughter, killing that was done there during the battle to reclaim Florida from Spain, who considered them French invaders. And the legend of the beautiful Spanish moss that hangs so majestically from trees is a reminder of the sometimes horrific and barbaric clashes between the Spanish conquistadores and the indigenous people whose home this was. There's a legend of the Spanish moss. Once, they say, there was a filthy, hairy, vulgar, brutal conquistador named Goresgos. Now, when he and the other sailors arrived here in La Florida, there were, as I said, already people here, indigenous Native Americans. And that included a beautiful native young woman that Goresgos saw and wanted. Oh yes, he saw her and wanted her. They say that he bought her. That's right, went and bought her for a bit of lace or ribbon and a bar of soap. But what he intended, no soap could clean. Oh, I can only imagine with his long hair and full beard, he must have appeared like a bear, a monstrous bear to her. But between you and me, I think that the bear might have smelled better. I thought it was interesting that he bought her for a bar of soap. Not that he would have used it much. The conquistadores were not known for their hygiene. Well, they say that Goresgos went after her. He went to grab her, and somehow that young woman escaped him and began to correr, to run through the woods. And of course, that conquistador Goresgos ran right after her. He ran, and there, by the edge of one of the many waterways that crisscross our state, he bore down on her. She looked around, and quickly, she scampered up a tree, climbing higher and higher and higher. But Goresgos would not be deterred. He too climbed up after her, yelling and screaming and threatening to make her pay for trying to escape his grasp. Now, as she neared the top, she saw that there was no place for her to go. They said he snarled as he reached for her. And that young woman leapt from the top of the tree and dove into the waters below. Goresgos was furious. He quickly tried to go down after her, but he slipped and he fell, crashing and smashing through the branches until he was caught amongst those sturdy branches. They say that he died there that day, and that young woman escaped. But it was not the end, no. They say that as his body and bones withered away, his long, gray, silvery beard continued to grow and grow and grow. And that, they say, is the legend of how Spanish moss came to be, a reminder, perhaps, of the perils of evil. Now, while Florida's Hispanic heritage has certainly shaped not only the culture and the history, but also the economy of our state for over 5 centuries, let us remember that before any of the Europeans came here, this was home to a wide variety of indigenous people whose languages and cultures and traditions were different. That's right. We truly are a land built of varied cultures and customs and languages and traditions. In fact, so many different flags have flown over Florida just since the Spanish conquistadores first landed here in the early 16th century. I mean, really. Florida has been a part of 5 different countries. It's true. Spain, France, Great Britain, the United States of America, and the Confederate States of America. Oh, and did I mention Spain? Yeah, we were part of the Spanish Empire not once, but twice. Each of those countries, of course, have brought their own sabores, flavors, as well as their flags. In fact, when Florida became the 27th state on March 3rd, 1845, the incoming Governor William D. Moseley, was presented with a flag from some citizens in Tallahassee, and that flag flew at his inauguration. However, there was a bit of a controversy that surrounded the motto on the flag, and so it never actually became an official state flag. The motto? Well, on that flag it simply said, "Leave us alone." Summed up how a lot of Florida folk felt, especially, I think, how some of the Florida crackers felt. Now let me clarify some things about Florida crackers. I know, elsewhere, a cracker might mean a little snack, something you would serve with cheese, or even quite nasty pejorative too. But here in Florida, it is a term referring to some of our early settlers, tough pioneering Florida families, and they are proud of the term Florida cracker. Now most agree that the term comes from the sound of those whips that the Florida cow hunters, the cracker cowmen, used to drive the cattle and flush them out of the palmetto scrub. Zora Neale Hurston, that Florida writer and folklorist, once talking about the area, and she grew up in Eatonville in Central Florida, she once said that this whole area was full of song and story. Some of the most robust and lusty songs of road and camp seem to sprout in this area like corn in April. Real characters that are poured into song and shaped into legend. I believe that probably one of the most famous cracker characters, and he was one, was a real man, named Bone Mizell, or Mizzle, as his cousin recently told me it was pronounced in the family. Now, Bone Mizell, he was a Florida cracker cow hunter that became quite famous. He was made famous when the well-known artist, Frederick Remington, painted him for Harper's Magazine. Made his mark, so to speak. But he was known for making his mark in other ways, too. Sometimes he would bite the ear of one of the cattle and say, "No one has that mark but me. Look at my crooked teeth, and that's how my mark is made." In fact, Bone was quite proud how he could change a brand quite easily when rustling for himself or others. In fact, one time he was arrested and brought right before a judge, some of whose cattle he had just been caught with rustling. Well, you would think he would throw in the book at him, but no. Instead, Bone was released and all charges dropped after he reminded the judge of the hundreds of other heads of cattle that he happened to rustle and rebrand as the judges at the judge's request. Oh, and then there was another time. There was that one time. A local sheriff caught wind of an illegal poker game going on. And when he got there, he found Bone and some other well-known cattle owners all sitting around the table with cards and poker chips. Well, of course, the sheriff broke up that game, halted it right then and there, explaining, "You're all under arrest. You're all going to have to pay fines. Chips are the same as money." They are. The next day, they were brought before the judge, and every one of those players was fined $85. Bone waited till everybody else had paid the fines, and then he went up to the sheriff, counted out $85 in poker chips, and when the sheriff stopped and said, Bone, can't pay with that. That ain't money." Bone just smiled and said, "Hey, Sheriff, yesterday yourself in front of several witnesses, you said, so we could all hear, that chips are the same as money." And with that, Bone turned around and walked out. Oh, there are so many Bone stories about that. Bone Mizell stories about him and his escapades. Now, it's interesting that the Spanish had their very own version of someone just like Bone Mizell. His name was Quevedo, and I'm telling you, he could have been kin to Bone. Bon Mizell and Quevedo both had reputations as great traviesos, rascals. And with both of them, kind of hard to know where the facts lay and the legends begin. But I do believe that there was a lot of truth in all those stories, whether they actually happened or not. Por ejemplo, for example, they say that it happened one time that Quevedo, un travieso, a mischief maker just like Bon Mizell, made the mistake this time of making El Rey Española, the Spanish king, the target of one of his jokes. Not a good idea. He had liked it when he made fun of other people, pero esta vez se enfadó, but this time he got fed up. He got fed up with Quevedo making fun of him and all his troublemaking. He got so fed up that the king ordered him ejecutado, executed. Well, they grabbed Quevedo, they threw him in jail, and on the day of his execution, he was brought before the king himself. Now, they had had a long history together. I kind of like that Judge and Bone. In fact, they probably had been friends at one time or another. I know for sure there had been many a time that the king had laughed at all of Quevedo's antics. Of course, not when he was the object of the joke. And so, Quevedo asked a boon. He asked if El Rey would, because of their long standing and their long-term relationship, if he would allow him to please, por favor, escoger, choose the manner in which he could die. Lo permitiré. I will permit it, said the king. I will. And so Quevedo made his request, there in front of the entire royal court. He announced that he would like to die at home, of old age. Well, El Rey, the king, had given his word in front of everybody, and so Quevedo was sent on home. I'm telling you, it was something that Bone would have done himself, would have made him proud. And that Florida cracker spirit, by the way, is still strong. We still have Cracker Cowmen. In fact, since the 1980s, the Florida Cracker Storytelling Festival is still held in Homeland, Florida every year. Great stories and an amazing cracker whip contest. Oh, I love to watch the young ones cracking that whip. You know, once you hear that sound of that whip breaking the sound barrier, you'll never forget it. It's still used to drive cattle and flush them out of the palmetto scrub. Oh, and not too far from there, over in Lake Wales, there lives a wonderful, nationally known songwriter and singer, Frank Thomas. He is a Florida cracker whose people came to Florida in the late 18th century. And Frank and his music has been called, well, that he's been called the father of folk music in Florida. His music is wonderful. His family's direct connection with the land, his strong Florida cracker heritage, and his love of Florida has inspired much of his music. Frank Thomas has written over 500 songs about Florida, including one of his best-known ones and one of my favorites, the Cracker Cowmen. Check it out if you have the chance. And those cows, well, our Florida cows are part of our Spanish legacy. It's true. Ponce De Leon brought the first cows on his second trip in 1521. He brought them right here to Florida. So as I like to remind both my brothers who happen to live in Texas, those Andalusian cows set foot on American soil right here in Florida, long before those Texas Longhorns, making Florida the very first cattle state on the North American continent. Oh, and the Spanish also introduced horses. In fact, our Florida cracker horses, often called marsh tackies, were brought here from Spain. Those small horses descended from the herds that the Spanish brought over in the early 1500s. All these sure-footed animals are beautifully suited to the terrain, perfect for the rough country and rough cracker cowmen. With our history, it should not be too much of a surprise to note that often many of us here in Florida speak a little bit of other languages, and sometimes without even realizing it, especially Spanish. And no wonder. Spain ruled Florida not once but twice, from 1513 to 1763. And then, 20 years later, from 1783 to 1821, when the Spanish gave Florida back to a young United States. In fact, our name, La Florida, viene del explorador, comes from the Spanish explorer Ponce De Leon. He named it when he first saw that luscious beach. And of course there's so many other names. Fernandina Beach was named after King Ferdinand VII. Boca Raton, mouth of the mouse. Cayo Hueso, Key West. And San Agustin, St. Augustine, the oldest continually inhabited U.S. settlement in the United States. Cape Canaveral means place of reeds or cane. You don't have to go far to find these other languages. Even our state reptile got its name when Ponce de Leon and his men first came here. When they first arrived on that shell-covered beach, they saw huge reptiles, a giant lizard. They had never seen something like that. They called it El Lagarto, the grand lizard. But of course, over time, El Lagarto became Alligator, and now we just call it alligator. So much of our economy has been influenced by our Spanish heritage. Our major industries like cattle. We've already talked about how the cows and horses were brought by the Spanish. But they also brought our first oranges here, our state fruit. Oranges are not native to Florida, and they are a major part of our economy. And the soil and hot and sunny weather that we have here are ideal for growing some of the sweetest and juiciest oranges. In fact, Florida oranges are prized around the world for their taste and sweet juice. Of course, those visitors were also, I think, our first tourists, weren't they? That hasn't stopped many others from coming here, and still are to this day. Unfortunately, though, the Spanish also brought with them some of those wild hogs that caused so much damage around our state. They were introduced by the Spanish explorer Hernando de Soto as early as 1539. It is said that if you want to understand what is important in a culture, that you should look at their folk tales, their folklore. They do indeed reflect the values and hopes and fears and dreams, and oftentimes the details of everyday lives. This Florida folktale comes from the Hispanic heritage, but interestingly enough, it's also found in our Florida African American communities. In fact, Zora Neale Hurston herself collected a version of it from her own hometown of Eatonville, Florida, and put it in her book of Mules and Men. It goes like this. Viejo González tenía un naranjo. Old man González had an orange tree. Oh, he loved that tree. It was as old and gnarled as well as old man González himself. It had been planted when he was just a boy, and oh, it had lo más dulce, the sweetest, lo más jugosos, the juiciest oranges of all. It was his favorite. He always said that that orange tree had been planted de las semillas, from the seeds, of las semillas of the seeds, of las semillas of the seeds, brought over here by the first Spanish to come to Florida. Y un año, 1 year, it was just filled. Oh, it was always a favorite with all the kids in the neighborhood, much to old man Gonzalez's dismay. He was running off one child or another all the time, but this year it was just filled with fruit. First it had filled with all those sweet-smelling blossoms, and now they had all ripened into fruit. As mi abuela, my grandmother, might say, no tenía vergüenza. That tree had no shame. It was just filled. And that's when 2 of the boys in the town had an idea. Rafa, mira nomás ese árbol. Look at that tree. Old man González's tree. Está tan lleno de fruta. It is so filled with fruit. Oye, tiene razón. Nosotros debemos ayudarlo. ¿No crees? Oh, I think you're right. We should help him. Oh, you know he's getting old. Sí, y con tanta fruta necesita ayuda. You're right. With so much fruit, we should help him. Ya sé. I know. Vamos a ayudarlo con la cosecha. Vamos a ayudarlo con la cosecha. That's right. We'll go and help him with the harvest. The only problem was they didn't bother to inform Old Man Gonzalez. No, they waited until bien noche, late that night, cuando todos estaban dormidos, when everyone was asleep, especially Viejo Gonzalez's old hunting dogs. Now they waited until all the lights were out, but before the moon came up, and they snuck into the yard. They climbed over that fence, and Rafa, he went right up the tree. Julio, he stayed down below con un costal with a sack. Rafa tossed down all the trees. In fact, they were so fast at their work, they had the costal, that sack, halfway full before the first dogs woke up and started to bark. And before Old Man Gonzalez could come out into the porch and turn the light on and call out, ¿Quién está ahí? Who's there? ¿Quién está ahí? Who's there? Those boys had grabbed that sack and were halfway across town. In fact, they didn't stop running until they were all the way just passing El Campo Santos, the cemetery. And that's when Rafa had an idea. Julio, ven, vamos a meternos aquí. Come on, let's go inside of here in the Campo Santos. Nadie nos va a buscar ahí. Oh, you are right. No one will look for us in there, said Julio. And the two traviesos, those two mischief makers, went inside and they followed el muro, the low stone wall, until they found a nice little clearing, a nice spot to repartir la cosecha, to divide up the fruit and share that harvest. Vaciaron el costal. They emptied out that sack. The oranges rolled around on the ground. A couple of them ended up against the wall of that stone wall, and they started to repartir, to divide it up. Una para mí, una para ti. One for me and one for you. Oh, tiene razón, you were right. Una para mí, una para ti. One for me and one for you. Una para mí, una para ti. One for me and one for you. Now, of course, they were not the only ones that had gone out that night. There were two other young men, the compadres, friends, como hermanos, like brothers. And they both were out celebrating. Lo que estaban celebrando, no sé. What they were celebrating, I have no idea. Pero estaban celebrando. They were out celebrating something. Even the parranda, they were out partying as they like to do on most Saturday nights, much to the frustration of their wives left back at home. Oh, and they had been out cantando, singing, and bailando, and dancing. Ay, 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 ay. Oy, compa, mira nomás. Oh, la calle está bailando también. Look, oh, you are right. The street, it is dancing too. Ooh, I hope it settles down soon. Vamos a descansar. Let us both wait here just for a moment till the street settles down. And as they stopped to rest, they both kind of leaned back just to wait for the street to settle down, and leaned their heads and backs against that stone wall that encircled the cemetery. And as they leaned back, they both kind of simultaneously slid down. Boom! Oye, compadre, vamos a descansar tantito. Oye, compadre, let us rest just for a moment here. And with that, they leaned their heads, cerraron los ojos, they closed their eyes just for a moment to rest. And that was when they heard it. Voices que venían del dentro del Campo Santos, that were coming from inside that cemetery. You know what they heard. Una para mí, una para ti. One for me and one for you. Una para mí, una para ti. One for me and one for you. Los dos se congelaron. The two men, they both froze. They froze. Que no podían ni respirar. They felt like they couldn't even breathe. Por fin, at last, uno le dijo al otro, the one said to the other, ¿escuchaste eso? Yeah, I heard that. ¿Qué crees? What do you think? Yo creo que es Dios y el diablo. I think so too. I think it must be God and the devil. Oh, están repartiendo almas. They're dividing up souls right now in El Campo Santos in the cemetery. And it was at that moment that Rafa noticed a couple of those oranges that had rolled over by the wall. And he said, Oye, no te olvides esos allí. Don't forget about those over there. Julio looked over and said, ay, mira, yo llevo estos, tú llevas estos. I'll take these, you take those. Y esos those two, pues llévalos tú. You take those two that are over there by the wall. Ah, ninguno de los dos sirven. Look at those two. Neither one are any good. You can have them both. And with that, those two compadres unfroze. Brincaron, they jumped up, and I think they practically flew home. I'm not even sure that their feet touched the ground. Now I have to tell you, their wives were both very surprised that they came home, and even though it was late, they both got up early the next morning for sunrise mass. In fact, something changed that night because they started going to church regularly almost every Sunday, and rarely did either one of them ever go out to celebrar, or ir de parrandear, or to party on a Saturday night anymore. You see, they changed their ways ever after that. They wanted to make sure that the next time they would be ready and in a different group when they next heard una para mí, una para ti, one for me and one for you. Un cuento folclórico, a folktale, very popular throughout our Hispanic communities, but especially those that have come over from Cuba throughout our state of Florida. It's one of the favorite stories about una cucarachita, a lovely little cockroach. Cucarachita Martina. Era una cucarachita muy linda y limpia. Little cockroach Martina was a lovely little cockroach and very clean, contrary to what people might think about cockroaches in general. Martina, she was a very good housekeeper. Oh, and she was beautiful. She had beautiful colored skin, como caramelo, like caramel, soft brown with dark black eyes and two straight little antennas. And as I said, she was a good housekeeper. Every morning she would echar un poquito de agua, sprinkle a little bit of water and el polvo and the dust in front of her house so that the dirt and the dust would not come in. Y se ponía a barrer. She would start to sweep the pathway to her house. Now one morning as she was barriendo, sweeping, encontró algo ahí en la tierra. She found something right there in the dirt. Una moneda. Oh, it was a coin. Una moneda de oro. A small gold coin. Ooh, ¿qué compraré con esto? What will I buy with this? Oh, ya sé. I know. Compro dulces. I'll buy some sweets and eat them. Oh, no, mejor no. I better not. I might get a bellyache. No. A lo mejor. And she thought of various things, and then she thought, ya sé. I know exactly what I will buy. Voy a comprar talco perfumado. I am going to buy some beautiful talcum powder, some white talcum powder. Oh, and after my bath, I told you she was a very clean cockroach. After my bath, I can put it on and feel fresh and smell sweet smelling. Oh, and that's just what she did. She compró el talco. She went and bought that perfumed talcum powder. And after she had bathed, she began to take that powder puff and covered herself from antenna down to her toes. Oh, she smelled so sweet, covered in that lovely light white talcum powder. and now she felt as sweet and as fresh as a flower, and she went to sit out on her front porch to see if anybody noticed her beautiful new perfume. Well, it didn't take very long, because people did pass by right in front, and when they went by, they could smell something sweet. The first one to pass by was Señor Cochinito, Mr. Pig. Oh, something smells good. Something smells good. Oh, Cucarachita Martina. Oh, qué bonito hueles. Oh, how good you smell. Quiero casarme contigo. I would like to marry you. ¿Quieres casar conmigo? Would you like to marry me? Oh, not tan rápido, not so fast. No. I have heard that por lo menos I should find out cómo me vas a hablar, cómo haces, what sound do you make, how will you speak to me if we get married. And so Cochinito began to show exactly how he would sing to her and speak to her. Oh, no. I do not like that sound at all. Oh, you frightened me with that song. Quítate, go away. And he did. Oh, can you imagine if he sounds like that during the daytime? What will he sound like at night? Well, not long after, somebody else came down the street. This time it was Señor Gato, the cat. Meow, meow. And he too also smelled something sweet. He came over to Cucarachita Martina and he said, "Oh, Cucarachita Martina, qué linda te ves. How, oh, beautiful you are looking and how sweet you smell. Cásate conmigo. Come and marry me, eh? ¿Y cómo haces tú? How do you speak? I would like to know how you will speak to me when we are alone at night." And he began to sing and tell her how he would speak to her. Gato began to sing, "Meow, meow." I no, quítate. I do not like that song at all. You scare me with such a song. Quítate, go away. Well, one after another they came trying to court her. None of them pleased that beautiful, lovely, sweet-smelling cockroach. Until Señor Ratoncito Perez, came down the street. Now I have to say, he had always noticed que linda, how lovely, and que limpia, how clean Cucarachita Martina was, and he had never had the nerve to speak to her before, but this night, when he smelled that beautiful perfumed talcum powder, he got the nerve to come over and said, "Buenas noches, good evening." Good evening, Señor Ratoncito Perez. How are you tonight? Oh, I am very fine. And they started to chat and to talk, and before long he said, Cucarachita Martínez, ¿te casarías conmigo? Would you marry me, please? Por favorcito, please. You are kind of sweet, but wait a minute. ¿Cómo haces tú? I want to know how you are. I want to know how you will speak to me if we get married, especially late at night when no one else is around. And so he began to sing. He began to tell her how he would speak to her right from his heart. Ratoncito Perez answered, "Ooh, I like the way you speak to me." And they went off and they got married. Oh, all their friends celebrated with them. In fact, after the wedding, Cucarachita Martinez, she decided that she was going to make a very special soup and invite everybody from the village around to celebrate their wedding. But she realized that she had forgotten something else. She made a wonderful onion soup with large golden pieces of onion just floating in that broth. But she had to go to the market for one more thing. And she told her husband, "Oh, Ratoncito Perez, Señor Ratoncito Perez, Mr. Mouse Perez, I want to go to the market to get one more thing to make this wonderful soup for you. But I want you to do me a favor, please. No levantas la tapa. Do not take the lid off. No. It needs to keep cooking, and I don't want you peeking in. It might be a very dangerous thing to do." And he agreed. But while she was gone, he waited. and waited, and he could smell, oh, the delicious aromas from that soup. And oh, Ratoncito Perez, his favorite was onion soup. He loved the onions when it became golden brown and caramelized on top, and he thought there would be no harm whatsoever just taking a little peek. So he went over to the soup. He lifted up la tapa, the lid to it. He peeked in. There was a golden onion right on top, one little nibble, just to make sure it was okay, and he leaned over that pot. He leaned in just to get a little nibble, and se cayó en la sopa. He fell into that soup. Oh no, no sabía nadar, and he did not know how to swim. Oh no, now not long afterwards, Cucarachita Martina came home. Ratoncito! Ratoncito mío! Little mouse! She called for him, Y se fue la olla. She went to the pot. She peeked inside, and there was his little mouse tail sticking out. Oh no! She grabbed him and pulled him out. And some say that's where the song came from. Ratoncito Pérez se cayó en la sopa. Oh, he fell into the soup. Oh no, widowed so young. Now some say that that's where the story ended. Oh, for getting a taste of the sweetness, he lost his life. But some say that's not how it ended at all. Some say that when she pulled him out, Ratoncito Perez lay there, and that's when Cucarachita Martinez started the very first CPR lesson, and that they actually lived quite happily ever after. No lo sé. I do not know. I was not there, but there are many versions of this story. You can look and check for yourself and see which one you prefer. Colorín colorado. Este cuento se ha acabado. 3, 2, 1. This story is all done, but yours is just beginning. I hope that you have enjoyed these Florida tales. Maybe you learned something new, or maybe just remembered something long forgotten. If you've enjoyed them, cuéntalas, compártelas. If you have enjoyed them, tell them, share them, for they are part of my story, y la suya, and yours as well. Gracias. Thank you for listening to me.